But the seeds were planted, and a decade later, when I went through my statist experience turning me and probably millions of others into free market types, Rand's work was very important. So there's a debate about whether it's Ayn Rand or Ayn Rand. There's a debate on the panel about that. But Atlas helped in the conversion because Rand understood very well that in business and the intellectual, why that business and politics creates the intellectual roots of statism, and that's my topic today. Rand understood very well the risk of an increasingly mixed economy, how politics could corrupt and threaten business, and why we have to resist that. Atlas itself foreshadowed many of the business and political debates that characterize today: rent-seeking, corporate social responsibility, sustainable development, the precautionary principle, efforts to drive market ideas from the marketplace of ideas. But Rand did not close the debate on this. She actually only began to open it. She did not really deal with, she did deal with what the business should or shouldn't do in the morally and intellectually foggy world of the mixed economy of today. At first brush, if you read Atlas, it seems that she suggests, like T.J. Rogers does, ignore politics and it'll all go away. Well, but Atlas also suggests that's a little painful, and that there are ideas she raises about how we might choose ways of better creating a strategy to get us out of this crazy place we've got ourselves into. The entrepreneurial class, the Hank Riddens of the world, the pro-economic intellectuals, we in this room, have yet to create the offensive alliance we need to make this happen. Atlas on business and politics. Atlas Shrugged begins with the question, who is John Galt, and ends with Galt tracing in the air the sign of the dollar. But in between the 1,166 pages, including the speech, that I didn't get fully to read last night, we've experienced a dramatic review, an accelerated format, of the Schumpeterian thesis. Question, can capitalism survive? And she ends up with a much more positive answer than Schumpeter did. Her novel can be seen as examining that Schumpeterian thesis as a heroic novel. Free individuals create wealth. That wealth makes possible the emergence of a middle class. The middle class means people who don't have to work from sunup to sundown. Some become entrepreneurs, doers. But that creates even a larger middle class in the next generation. Others become thinkers, intellectuals. What's it all about? Why is there racism, poverty, sexism, war, and so forth? These are interesting questions. We want gadflies always thinking about how society could become even better. How could we move towards our ideals? But the intellectuals, after all, occasionally look up from their scribblings and say, wait a minute, if we're so moral and good and smart, why the hell are they making all the money? They're envious. And envy, being an unadmirable trait, is quickly rejected, reformed, transformed into theories of social delegitimization of the marketplace. Entrepreneurs, heroes, give me a break. These people give me a break. These people are essentially villains. They're exploiting women, the poor, blacks, the planet now. And if you read Rand, then you mostly have the plaintive cries of Balk Eubank, Bertram Scudder, Claude Schlagenhoop. He was the head, if you may recall, of the Friends of Global Progress. And don't you love all these names? And where did she get them from? They filled the pages of Atlas, and they filled them quite well. But envy is something that they realized was not admirable, and they came up with very elaborate situations. It did, in fact, a war society with views of why business is bad, why we need the justice of the state to bring about a more utopian order. We need, and that succeeds. We've certainly moved towards a vast mandarinette around this society. But if you're going to create a mandarinette, you need mandarins, GS-14s, who will be paid well to create a society of justice, of order, of themselves benefiting. But intellectuals are important. Rand was said about that, but of course Hayek said it even more. The role of intellectuals, the intermediaries between most people and the rest of the world, are critical, and with their defection to statism, has been a great threat to economic liberty. That's why the reemergence of classical liberalism in the world is such a tremendous step forward in making it possible to again have hopes of a freer world. But the state in Atlas did expand from the equalization of opportunity to the anti-dog eat dog. That is, incidentally, pretty much what the antitrust laws are, to the totalitarian directives of 10289. We haven't quite got that, although elements of the Homeland Security Act touched upon it. Every new enlargement of the state is justified by the problems created by the past enlargement. We solve problems by creating ever bigger problems for ourselves. But all of that is not without cost to the business community, too. Rand realized that individuals within the business community would collaborate. People collaborated in World War II. They certainly collaborate in the war of politics and ideas. Some, like Orrin Boyles or Jim Taggart, are simply rent seekers, working to cripple their opposition via regulations, taxes, to basically set the world in their favor using government to do it. But Rand realized something else. She realized that the problems of government were not just economic, they were also ideological. Entrepreneurs have children who disdain their parents and, once in power, transform their once entrepreneurial firms into piggy banks to bolster their weak self-images, ignoring the increase in shareholder wealth mission to find other things to do with their monies. The horrific story of the Storms family, the father who, remember, created the 20th Century Motor Fund, is instructive. The children, when they come into power, place a communal, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need, management system with the predictable losses of individual freedom, hierarchic security and order, and egalitarian justice, most importantly. They make a monster out of a corporation that had been a productive organization. A subsequent owner, Eugene Lawson, fully internalized the corporate social responsibility beliefs that dominate today, telling Dagny, "Don't despise me. I've never made a profit." And if you recall, Dagny looks at him and said, "That's the most despicable thing I've ever heard in my life." The 20th Century Motors also produced, as you recall, John Galt, not known at that time, who stepped forward and said, "I will put an end to this once and for all. I will stop the motor of the world." And as you recall, he did. The Storms were early corporate social responsibility advocates, but today, almost everyone in the Fortune 500 in America and abroad are signers on to this same insane philosophy. And of course, it accounts for the rise in the novel of the Jim Taggarts, the Orrin Boyles. They get their glowing media stories about Associated Steel, housing projects for the poor, educational movies for high schools, efficiency awards for something, not making money. The companies never seem to worry about making money, but they get all these awards and publicity, and they feel good about themselves. This desire of the CEOs to be adulated by the chattering class is one of the driving, corrupting forces of politics and business today. Even more tragic is how the corporate social responsibility concept has undermined the moral values of business itself. You remember Dan Conway. He heads Phoenix Durango Railroad. He decides not to fight for the survival of his company. Why? Because he says, quote, "because they had the right to do it," unquote. Entrepreneurs are doers, not necessarily intellectuals. They create wealth, but they often lack the understanding, the framework to explain the moral value of wealth and knowledge creation in a world that is still desperately poor and desperately backward. Rand's intellectual lefties were certainly not going to instruct the business community on their moral value. That is the role of groups like ours, of groups like the Objectivist Center. We have to give business a concept of the soul that a creative entrepreneur possesses. Some businessmen, of course, never bother with even going that far. They're the Quislings of the corporate world, the Wesley Mooches, who basically do very, very well. They screw their companies, and then they go become government bureaucrats at nice salaries. But it's important to realize that the heroes of this story also have their blame in this area. To Hank Rearden, after all, what was his responsibility? Let me give you some quotes. Rearden disliked politics. He knew that it was necessary to have a man to protect him from the legislature. All industrialists had to employ such men. But he had never given much attention to this aspect of his business. He could not quite convince himself that it was necessary. An inexplicable sense of distaste, part fastidiousness, part boredom stopped him whenever he tried to consider it. Trouble is, he said to his friend, that the men one has to pick for this kind of job are such a crummy lot. Well, I meet them every day, and there's something to that. Rearden understood nothing about that kind of fight, the article goes on. He left it to Mooch and his staff. He could barely find time to sign the checks which Mooch requested for the battles in Washington. But Hank signed the checks. But he essentially left politics to Mooch. He doesn't like Washington. He doesn't trust it. He doesn't understand it. And he wants it to leave him alone. And if you recall in Atlas Shrugged, it doesn't. Dagny, musing on her brother's Washington ability, his skills at getting favors from the legislature, realizes she knows nothing about politics either. She knows there's a reason there. There's kind of work that you have to do, necessary work, sort of distasteful, like cleaning sewers. But neither she nor Hank spend any time overseeing this offensive but necessary work, and their neglect is partially responsible for the disastrous downturns in their companies. Can one imagine any of Rand's heroes being so cavalier about an employee given responsibility for running a locomotive or overseeing a blast furnace? And Atlas Shrugged progressives, far more locomotives and blast furnaces are destroyed by government action than would have ever been destroyed by an inept employee in their companies. Most CEOs today are Hank Reardons and Dagny Taggarts at best. They don't take policy seriously, and it shows. Our challenge is to reach out to the entrepreneurial elements of the business world to help them chart a moral course in the